The Psychedelic Report.
Psychedelic drugs
have played their part in America's long, strange trip toward an understanding of mind-altering drugs.
The psychedelic news.
Leading physicians, scientists, and experts share their wisdom about psychedelic medicines and healing.
50 years ago, psychedelic drugs were at the center of America's counterculture.
The brightest minds in psychedelic medicine. The Psychedelic Report.
We use the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy model that happens to have psychedelic effects that were not predicted when the drug was first developed.
From researchers to investors.
I think the biggest mistake we've made as a culture is the war on drugs.
To physicians to shamans and nonprofit pioneers.
Psychedelic drugs.
Recent research suggests some of them could have legitimate uses.
The psychedelic news
brings you diverse perspectives from the front lines of this exciting movement. The Psychedelic Report.
The Psychedelic Report was brought to you by Apollo Neuroscience and produced by Future Medicine Media. Welcome to the Psychedelic Report, your single source of truth for the psychedelic news. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Rabin. I'm a neuroscientist and psychiatrist trained in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy as well as MDMA-assisted therapy. I'm here to bring you another special conversation today around the future of research. For decades, research has been conducted predominantly in the lab or in the clinic. Medical research has focused on very specific populations of people in controlled settings that are not necessarily representative of the real world and our regular day-to-day lives. We have seen this play out when discoveries successfully complete clinical trials, but struggle to actually be replicated in the real world. And on top of that, these types of clinical trials that we conduct currently are extremely expensive and make it very challenging to understand how plant products and natural products can positively benefit our health. To explore this topic more deeply, I am pleased to be joined by Dr. Jeff Chen. Dr. Jeff Chen is an impact entrepreneur, executive, physician, and scientist on a mission to transform the health of our bodies and minds using non-pharmaceutical products. He is co-founder and CEO of Radical Science, an AI-driven health tech B Corp providing history's first proof-as-a-service solution for wellness products to easily prove their true effects at unprecedented affordability, speed, and scale. This is extremely important as we look forward into the future of doing clinical research in the real world and making these solutions available to everyone. Radical Science was named by KPMG as one of the top 10 U.S. tech innovators of 2022 and by Fast Company as a world-changing idea. Dr. Jeff gave a main stage talk on Radical Science at TED 2023. On top of that, Jeff was the founder and executive director of a UCLA research center where he led clinical trials on natural products like cannabis. Dr. Jeff has been interviewed by outlets including CNN, Forbes, Wall Street Journal, Time, NPR, Entrepreneur, Rolling Stone, NBC News, Financial Times, Politico, Business Insider, Vice, and Vogue for his expertise. Following a Bachelor's of Science at Cornell, Dr. Jeff earned his MD and MBA concurrently at UCLA. Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Dave. I've been looking forward to this.
Maybe we could start off by you telling us a little bit about, you're a physician, you are a researcher and an entrepreneur, and research seems to be a bit of a passion for you. Could you just start by telling us a little bit about how you got here and what led you into your current journey?
Probably traces back all the way to my childhood, where I had, Chinese immigrant parents. As a boy, they were like, "You're going to be a doctor," and I was like, "Great." So they're like, "You'll have a stable job," the one thing that we didn't have. But my parents are also entrepreneurs. So talk about and I worked for my mom ever since I was 11, kind of like the sole full-time employee of her small business. And so I kind of always grew up with this, I went through all the motions to get ready for med school, but like I was exposed to business from an early age. I studied business in college as well. So it kind of naturally led to me being interested in healthcare systems and thinking that the best impact that I could create is, yes, to become a physician, but then to also be seeing how I can run and manage and improve these healthcare systems. And when I went time to go to grad school, I specifically looked for programs where you could train as a physician executive. And that's what I did at UCLA. So they had this special program where you get your medical degree and your MBA kind of integrated and interwoven together. And when I graduated from that program, I had become actually quite disillusioned with the healthcare system, namely the fact that I might spend my entire career trying to enact significant change and just fail horribly because of so many regulatory barriers that stood in the way, and or all of the interests that candidly make more money the more disrupted and intermediated healthcare is. And so at that point, I started looking around and I realized, it's possible that one of the best ways to deliver improvements in health in my lifetime was to focus on the areas where you don't need the healthcare system. And that was lifestyle and wellness and mind-body medicine and supplements and all this other stuff. And as I looked at that landscape, I realized that these things weren't widely used to their full effect, not because people weren't interested in them, not because they were expensive, not because they were hard to access. In fact, it was the opposite. They were affordable, they were easy to access. What was missing was our fundamental understanding of whether they did anything, what dose was most appropriate, what type of person should use what type of product for what type of health area. And so I started a research center after graduating from grad school. And at the time I was torn between, do I go do residency or do I have this opportunity in front of me to start this research center? And at the time it was 2017 and cannabis was going onto the ballots in California for potential legalization. And if it was legalized, it would make California by far the largest state or country in the world with legal cannabis. So as I saw that 6, 7, 8, 9 months away, I said, there needs to be a research center here at a premier institution like UCLA. And so I started pitching the university. I started figuring out how the hell do you create a research center? How do you get this funded? And in parallel, I was actually applying to residency programs and going to the match. Right before rank lists were due, I decided to not pursue that. And lo and behold, several months later, it looked like what I hoped has come true, that they were greenlighting the research center and that I was kind of coming in to build it and lead it as kind of the founder and the executive director. And so from 2017 to 2020, we were running some of history's first rigorous, blinded, placebo-controlled trials on cannabis, whole cannabis, cannabinoids like CBD, looking at the effects of things like terpenes, for example, as well. And it was through that process that I came face to face as my first real foray as a researcher and scientist in that capacity, as well as working with brilliant researchers and scientists who taught me a bunch, that the whole process was pretty antiquated and really slow and really expensive. These studies were small and the people in the studies were super homogenous. And then I kept wondering, do these people resemble people that we're going to try to apply these results to or make recommendations to?
Right.
And so I realized this is not going to scale. And so it was in 2020 that I decided my time in academia had come to an end and kind of hired my replacement and stepped away and to start Radical Science. And so that's kind of been my journey to being a founder.
I'd love to hear that. I think that you have a different path than I think a lot of us entrepreneurs have, because you came up in a mainstream academic institution and you were able to actually invoke some change in that institution, right? You helped to found this center, the UCLA Cannabis Research Center, right? And that was a huge triumph, I would say, for any public institution to start a center like that. It's a really big deal. And to be able to kick off some of those studies, which were some of the first studies of whole plant cannabis in the world, probably, right, in the last 100 years, is really exciting. And then you also, at the same time, had firsthand experience where you came face to face with some of the challenging barriers in academic medicine and science, right? Which is, like you said, small sample sizes, everything has a lot of overhead. It's really expensive. Change is slow, right? And so then this inspired you to take research outside the box and create Radical Sciences. So can you tell us a little bit about Radical and what you're doing over there?
Yeah, and so the vision that started with Radical, and for those who listening who may or may not be familiar, my co-founder is actually a brilliant woman named Kayleen Thorogood, and she had kind of arrived at a similar conclusion that I had arrived at, which is, why can't there be a near-term future where you wake up in the morning and you have some health issue, and rather than make an appointment, seeing a doctor, getting a prescription, go to a pharmacy, paying a copay, arguing with your insurance, doing it 6 days later for a refill, having side effects, whatever, you just, you fill out some questions on a survey and you're matched to a product that not only is proven to be better than placebo, but more specifically, there's a layer of data analytics, there's a layer of prediction, there's a layer of AI that also knows out of all of the sleep products out there, wellness sleep products, supplement sleep products out there better than placebo. This one is most likely work for someone like you based on your age, your gender, your ethnicity, your lifestyle, the severity of your sleep. Is it falling asleep issues? Is it waking up too early? Why doesn't that exist? And what we fundamentally realize is you need that data. There needs to be highly rigorous data across all these products and all these health conditions. And we said, okay, well, shoot, why doesn't that data exist today? It's because clinical trials are these insanely expensive, slow ordeals that generally large universities can get big government grants to deal with, or more commonly, pharma is just pumping money into these trials. And it makes sense for pharma when they have a patent and monopoly business model to invest 10, 50, $100 million in clinical trials on one drug to get it FDA approved. These wellness products, these natural products, these supplements, they can't be patented. They can't afford 100 million. They can't afford 10. They can't even afford 1 million. So it's like, how do you get that barrier down? So that's what we kind of set out to do with radical science, is take clinical trials, maintain all of the same rigor, drop the cost, drop the time by an order of magnitude, so cheaper and faster, but also make them better. And that better piece really comes down to the large sample sizes, diverse populations, people using these products in real world settings so that that data is most translatable to someone picking this off the shelf at a grocery store. If you think about clinical trials, they happen in these artificial settings, in a hospital, strict usage, all this stuff. Great, but that just means that the data from that trial reflects synthetic, artificial, perfect usage. And so the second you're out in the real messy real world using the product, not under those conditions, how do you know that you're going to have those same results? And that's kind of what we set out to do with radical science. And it was in 2020. So the pandemic had kind of disrupted the clinical trials, disrupted operations at UCLA, and that was kind of the final straw for me. And so at Radical, when we were building Radical, said we got to make this also pandemic. So it's virtual, it's direct to consumer. As soon as you go virtual as well, you've eliminated all the overhead. I don't need hospitals, clinics, on-site nurses, research coordinators, and unparalleled diversity starts to come in. People in rural populations, people that work 2 jobs, people with kids at home and would never participate in a clinical trial and have to drive to a hospital, people of color who fear the healthcare system. But hey, receiving a product in the mail, answering, providing data via their device, things like that seems much more approachable to them. So those are kind of some of the things that we set out to do to create this ability for any wellness product to finally prove their true effects. And eventually, with enough data, to really allow consumers to really take charge of their own health and know which product could be most likely to work for someone like them. And it costs $29 at the grocery store and doesn't involve the healthcare system.
Yeah. Or you can order it from this website to your house in 3 days, right? There's
even better. Correct. You don't even need to leave the house. Correct.
Yeah. And I think this is really fascinating because, we're talking about, in my mind, this is the future of medical research, right? We're taking trials that used to be only done in a lab, that in the clinical setting, and that were, limited to people who could find tons of funding, like pharmaceutical companies or medical technology companies and universities. And now there's a democratizing of that to the point where we're able to conduct real world research. And the benefit of the real world research is that people are actually living their regular lives in the course of the study, which is therefore more representative of the population oftentimes than we see in the clinical population. Like you said, in the lab, in the clinic, people have a certain disease only, or maybe they only take certain kinds of medication, but not other kinds of medication, right? And there's a lot of stuff, a lot of people get excluded from those studies that get done at universities. I think the move towards remote and more crowdsourced or real world community-based research, field studies, they used to be called field studies, right? It transforms the clinical trial landscape in a really important way. We've done a lot of this work with Apollo 2, where we can do studies of people using our product in the wild, using wearable technology and things like that. And it creates a much easier way to do good quality science that actually means something to people. And I think there's one other thing that you said in particular that stood out to me that's interesting, which is this affects all of us. Every time any of us who are listening to this who have been to a drugstore or supermarket and walk down the supplement aisle, right? You're surrounded by brand after brand after brand that look mostly the same. They tell you they have mostly the same ingredients, and yet they're all making the same claims about what they're going to do for your health. And there's almost no information about how one is different from the other. And so how are you supposed to know what formulations to take, which ones not to take, which ones for you, right? Which ones maybe not for you, which is important. And also dosing is important. And this information just requires the average person to go on Google and search for it and then guess that what they're reading is reliable. And what I think is so cool about what you guys have done and are continuing to do is to give people a sense of reliability and evidence that challenges the current system with which we now make it unaffordable for supplement companies to do studies of their product. You're making it affordable. And then all of a sudden we can actually do side-by-side comparisons and see, is St. John's wort as effective at treating depression as Zoloft, or is CBD and CBN mixed together as good for sleep as Ambien or Trazodone, right? There are like different kinds of studies that we can do that now become available to us as researchers, scientists, and for the general public that were not possible to do before.
Yeah, that's precisely it. And, field studies, it's an interesting way to look at it. And I think the way that we've been blending the best of both worlds. So all of our trials are still double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled, IRB approved, pre-registered. It's like the highest quality standards. But you're right, we're shipping product to people's homes. There's no dude in a white coat looking over their shoulder, forcing them to change their usage differently. And so from that standpoint, it's really real world usage. And we call them, these are our citizen scientists. We've had 40,000 of them go through our various trials so far. And they're people who are having certain health issues and we're about to go purchase a natural product anyway. But by being in our studies, they get the product for free. We're giving them tools to track their health, and we're giving them health reports at the end of their studies. And they're volunteers. There's no pay involved. And if you kind of look at the counter side of this, like in pharma studies, it's heavily inconvenient. You have to physically go there a bunch. You're taking something that's synthetic, it's scary, it's not approved. You're a human guinea pig. And at the end of it, they generally don't unblind you. So you're not sure if you got the placebo or the real thing. And they're definitely not giving you your data back. And because of all that risk they're putting you through and all that inconvenience, they have to pay you money. So you can kind of see the fact that tens of thousands of Americans willing to volunteer for no money to be in our studies. It's because it's convenient and they're getting something back. They're getting free products. They're getting unblinded. They're getting their data back. And they're part of this movement that we're creating. And we are a public benefit corporation. And we started this movement, and these citizen scientists and volunteers, everyday people are joining this movement as well, where they think it should be the case that we know what these products do. It should be the case that there isn't this confusion that you describe when you walk down the aisle. And there shouldn't be the case that only pharma has data as to what their stuff works. I mean, look, after all, I believe it's almost half, if not slightly more than half, of all FDA-approved small molecule drugs were first discovered in plants. Well, man, those same plants are sold just in a raw extract, and let's go prove what that stuff does. And so I think that there's a tremendous opportunity here. I think it's really poetic in many ways that it's these citizen scientists that are powering these crowdsourced clinical trials on democratized products. And with that proper proof, they go from being democratized products to democratized medicines. That really is that kind of motivating vision behind Radical that gets me excited, that gets our entire team excited. And we're chugging along every day with our heads down, just trying to make that vision a reality.
Yeah, I love the way you're thinking about this. And I've thought about all the incredible things we could do with the data that we have access to if we just could get into one place and organize it, right? And it's just so disparate. And what you're doing with Radical is really cool because of it also creates an organized, data set that you can start to understand how some of these things in the world are working that we don't quite understand, right? You're increasing our understanding of different tools that we have available to us. You're listening to the Psychedelic Report. One of those tools that I have talked about and written about a lot lately, in particular, is cannabis. And you mentioned this earlier, and I think, cannabis is a fascinating molecule. The THC dominant forms of cannabis can have psychedelic properties. The more CBD and non-psychoactive cannabinoid dominant molecules can have no or fewer psychedelic properties, but potent anti-inflammatory properties. They can help with pain. They can help with nausea. They can help with sleep. There's been a lot of anecdotal evidence over the years, but few real, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled studies of cannabinoid products for this purpose. And part of the reason why I'm bringing this up is because we recently published a paper, a review article summarizing the evidence for the use, safety, and effectiveness of using cannabinoid products, mostly focused on non-psychoactive cannabinoids like CBD, to treat opioid use disorder and chronic pain, and provided some guidance to physicians around how to do this safely so that patients have options and the clinicians treating their pain have options then they can be educated about. At the same time, when we wrote that review, there were almost no double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trials of cannabis products, even at that time. That was published last year. What kinds of work are you doing in the cannabis space, and how do we start to do a better job of understanding how the cannabis plant, with its some 200 plus different cannabinoids and of course terpenes and other molecules, has these effects on the body?
Oh man, there's a lot here. So I guess the first thing I would say is certainly the Schedule 1 drug classification of cannabis and naturally occurring THC that has been in place to this day and continues to this day certainly hampers research dramatically.
Absolutely.
On top of all of the difficulties in general, clinical research that we just touched upon, add on another layer of difficulty of the fact that if you want to procure cannabis at a university, let's say you somehow magically found funding for this, which is still hard to come by. If you want to procure said cannabis, you have to go to a DEA authorized cannabis producer, which is only a few. There used to only be one. Now there's a few. You cannot go to any of the federally illegal, but state legal tens of thousands of providers of cannabis. You have to go to the few that have recently gotten a DEA license. So you're limited in your supply. And furthermore, the way you store it, it's under lock and key and like a blast-proof safe with camera, like all this stuff to give someone some cannabis, even though they could walk across the street to a dispensary and have a joint.
It's like years, to put this in time frame schedule, I feel it's like years worth of bureaucratic barriers just to
get started. And then, correct, literal years and years and years. And then once you actually start, then you're subject to the years it takes in general just to start and complete a clinical trial. So that clearly hampers it. Also, you're right. Running studies on cannabis, just broadly as a term, does get really complicated because it has so many bioactive molecules. Some of those are the cannabinoids you mentioned. Other ones aren't even specific to the cannabis plant, terpenoids. They're present in all sorts of different plants. They tend to be abundant in cannabis, but they also have physiologic properties. So it gets really tricky. There's two ways to look at it. You can either go fully reductionist and just go to pure molecules, pure THC, pure CBD, pure CBN, and study that, or create some sort of a standardized cannabis extract. And as long as you can grow it pretty consistently and extract it pretty consistently, then you study that extract. Outside of those two domains, if you're not able to work with consistent material, your results, again, they don't translate. Like, here's this one interesting extract. Let's say it had amazing properties. Great, but I can't recreate it. So what was the point of that?
And that's a really important point you just brought up, because I think that is actually one of the best things that the FDA has done. It's actually, I would say, the best and worst thing, right? Because on the good side, what they've done is they created a certain standard of consistency for the quality of pharmaceutical product that you're taking, be it like a prescription drug. It has to meet a certain percentage of it. It has to be the pure version of what they're telling you it is, right? And it has to be the same, almost the same every time, within a very, very small, like 5 to 10% margin of error. Right. But the problem with that is that it has led to a single molecule focus where we're really talking about what does just the THC do by itself, or what does just the CBD do by itself, because putting a whole plant through a process like that would be nearly impossible, because you can't get whole plants to be as consistent as you can get a pill or a powder or an extract, right?
Yeah, or if you just purify one molecule from the plant versus trying to worry about keeping these top 10 molecules all in consistent ratios and consistent potencies. So, the reductionist model from the pharma angle made sense at the time for what their goals were. But now when we think about, for instance, like food, and we're realizing right now in America, but like if you could change one thing and fundamentally change the health of every American, it's probably feeding them better food, both in quality as well as like the appropriate volume of food. So we're going through these heroic efforts to try and treat cancer, heroic efforts to treat all these things, when it's probably the food supply that's causing so much of these issues in the first place. Now, speaking of food, you could take a reductionist approach as well and be like, oh, well, with the same lens that we take with pharma, why don't I just feed you protein? I give you a mush, protein, carbs, that's great. But you're not going to thrive because there's an insane, inordinate amount of phytonutrients present in food that we haven't even begun to fully understand the implications. You could see that analogy kind of carrying over once you start talking about natural products and botanicals and supplements and things like that. And I think there's room for both. There's some instances where a reductionist approach makes sense, especially if you can't create consistent plant extract. But when you can create consistent plant extract, like you often hear about standardized ashwagandha extracts that have been really, really well characterized and standardized, and then it's that entire ashwagandha extract that's studied in trials. That makes sense. But in other cases where you haven't been able to reach that amount of standardization, then sure, you purify and you go after the individual molecules. For Radical, we have not studied federally illegal cannabis products. And that's because all of our studies are happening over state lines. We're mailing products to people. We're subject to federal laws. We have studied hemp extracts and purified cannabinoids from hemp, some of which that data has recently been made public and published. For instance, we are the first people, the first researchers in history to actually run human clinical trials on the effectiveness of CBN for any health condition. And specifically, we showed that it does indeed improve sleep and that it may be as effective. In that case, it was a multi-arm study. It may be as effective as melatonin, which is really interesting because melatonin is like the single most widely studied and widely used non-pharmaceutical for sleep. And what's interesting is, yes, there was a lot of anecdotal data about CBN for sleep, but there's never been a single actual clinical trial comparing it head against placebo till we came along. And we pulled that off in a relatively quick amount of time. But when it comes to THC cannabis, that's federally illegal. We haven't been able to work with that material just because we're shipping products across state lines. And there's still some other cannabinoid research underway here at Radical. But one key aspect of what we do is really working collaboratively with our clients to figure out when and where and how it makes sense to talk about their results. So we're really here in some ways to be a safe container for them to experiment and be able to come in and have a safe place to experiment and try and sometimes possibly fail. And that's okay because it's not an existential risk to their brand. Whereas unfortunately, when you oftentimes work with universities, whether you're a pharma company or a supplement company, they have academic freedom and they can publish whatever they want. So, there's already enough friction and barriers to getting clinical trials. And now suddenly throw in the existential risk to your brand, no one's going to do it. So that was kind of one concession that we made at Radical, which is like, look, we're reducing two massive barriers, the cost and the time. And then the third place is eliminating the risk to their brand reputation.
Sometimes studies don't go right? It's just a reality. Even with psychedelics, we've seen that happen.
Yeah. And we'd rather that the client and brand knows and they'll go and try again rather than them being scared of the damage to their brand and not doing the study to begin with and continuing to sell that product in the market. At least they know.
Yeah.
So we kind of made that a very conscious decision to give them that safe place to fail because we realized net in the long run, it was better for consumers. It was better for society. It would only encourage more attempts at validation, attempts at becoming clinically proven. And even if they weren't successful studies, it's at least knowledge for them to go back to the drawing board versus just being kind of in the dark and just selling something that was no better than placebo.
Yeah, absolutely. You're giving product manufacturers an opportunity to put the incentives in the right place around the stuff they're creating actually working and doing what it's supposed to do for the client, which is really amazing. And the thing that you said earlier that was actually what I want to come back to, because I think that's just an absolutely fascinating finding, is when you were talking about CBN for sleep, right? Because I think that highlights exactly what we're talking about, about why the approach you have at Radical Science is so important, is because how long have we been hearing about people anecdotally reporting?
right. Decades.
That's right. Decades.
Sure. Yeah.
Decades of people anecdotally reporting that CBN makes you sleepy, right? Clinical trials were never done because of all the barriers we just talked about. And then you guys come along, you've been around for 4 years, and you just finished your first CBN trial that How long did it take you to do this trial? 2 years?
Oh gosh, no. From start to finish, 9 months.
Okay.
And that study involved almost 1,500 people. So I think we've also, in a short amount of time as a company, we've studied more people. We've studied more people. We've administered more cannabinoids to people in clinical trials than all other researchers in history combined.
Right. In just 4 years of being around. And then you answered one of the key questions about CBN that has always been on our minds as doctors is, could CBN be a reasonable alternative to current sleep aids with way less side effects? And the answer is yes. Right. And so I think that is just part and parcel. The main takeaway that I want most people to have from this conversation is, if anybody tells you that there isn't another way to do it, there is always another way to do it. And you just have to put your head down and see what's going on, or look up and see what's going on, and really try to think of a better way. And this is one example, right? This is so many years of work that you guys have been able to optimize, and through optimizing your research protocols and adapting them to the needs of a general consumer market and a supplement type market, right? You've radically accelerated our knowledge in terms of science of, we'll just say cannabinoids alone, right? By maybe in terms of therapeutic benefit of cannabinoids, 100% more than we knew before you guys started working in this field, right? Just from that CBN finding alone. So that's a really fascinating demonstration of what you guys can do. I'm so excited to hear about some of your future projects.
Yeah, and you can see some of the other data that we've released. And again, this is where we work collaboratively with our clients to, the right timing, and we've published peer-reviewed papers. We've had several peer-reviewed papers published on our methods. And you can find all of those online on our website, some of the other findings. For instance, this one's pretty interesting. A team of Cedars-Sinai doctors, for those of you who aren't familiar, Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, big hospital and healthcare system here in LA, one of the top in the nation. It was a team of 4 Cedars-Sinai doctors. They came up with a botanical blend and they tested it with us. And it was significantly better than the placebo group at sleep, but also significantly better than placebo for, I want to say, like mood and quality of life and like relaxation, several health domains that it moved the needle on. And this is a team of Western MDs. Some of them were surgeons. Some of them were like heads of their division at Cedars. It was really interesting to see these Western trained MDs creating botanical products because they were so fed up of their patients being like, hey, I don't want this pharma drug. What else can I try? And they're like, oh, I don't really know what to tell you. I have, the stuff out there, a lot of it's not proven. So that was really interesting.
Give us this list, pick.
Right? Yeah, exactly. So that was fun too, in some ways, to like let entrepreneurial folks birth their products with Radical. Rather than testing something that was already in the market to get additional claims, they went to market with something after having tested it with us. And the other thing I also want to bring up is just the serendipity of all the twists and turns in my own career, my co-founder's career, that kind of took us to this moment. Her career has been in tech and big data, and then eventually philanthropy and medicine from a philanthropy standpoint, working with universities, trying to give them money, trying to get them to do things faster, that led us to create this. And you look backwards on it, like I couldn't have predicted any of this, how the twists and turns of my personal life and career led to this. So I guess all of that is to say that if you're sitting around wondering what is your calling, what's next for you, there's an element of unpredictability and serendipity and surrender that you kind of have to lean into, and just know that there is something unique to your experience, unique to your skill sets, unique to your community, unique to people around you that are going to form your team and support you. And whether it's an entrepreneurial endeavor, whether it's an effort that you want to take on in your community, whether it's an effort that you want to start to take on with your family. For instance, I'm starting to start a lot of little projects with my family, really trying to heal a lot of this intergenerational trauma that's plagued my family. A lot of messed up stuff has happened to several generations of Chinese, from like European conquest to like Japanese invasion to communist revolution, all these things. So I look at all of this, and you can't really separate any of it. So like your personal growth, your personal journey, the eccentricities of your career, seemingly bad things that happen to you. And so I think that's to say that I feel very blessed that I'm in this moment feeling so aligned, have such clarity on what it is my current purpose is right now. And I thank all of the little twists and turns and all the ups and downs that led me to here. And thank God I didn't get all the things that I wanted early in life.
Yeah, well, beautifully said. Thank you so much for sharing that.
You're listening to The Psychedelic Report.
As this is the Psychedelic Report, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about psychedelics beyond cannabis. And we did talk about some of the federal barriers to cannabis research with THC, and we know that many of the psychedelic molecules are also DEA Schedule 1 drugs. Mm-hmm. So they are also subject to the same complicated barriers. However, there have been a bunch of folks lately who have been doing some really interesting crowdsourced psychedelic research. And a lot of it has been focused on, in the latter cases, looking at thousands of people who are using their own psychedelics and then tracking them digitally over time, which ended up getting some pretty decent size publications. And I think Paul Stamets and Jim Fadiman were on those studies because they were mostly looking at microdosing behavior. But those are the only two large-scale observational studies that I've seen in the psychedelic literature looking at real-world use in a big population, real-world use of psychedelics. There really aren't that many, and most of the rest of them are done in the clinical setting still, not in the real world. There are very few real-world trials, and I'm curious, based on your work, how do you see the psychedelic research field kind of coming to be successful and kind of breaking free of some of the rigid academic chains with like a crowdsourced research environment?
Ooh, so many things here. Well, one thing, I know we're saying psychedelics beyond cannabis, but one thing that I often think about is when we talk about psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and a lot of us are waiting eagerly for MDMA to be approved, but then, who's going to be allowed to administer it? Is insurance going to cover it? Like, what's going on with that? I mean, cannabis can alter states of consciousness. It can allow people to enter a state of presence and or reflection that they might not be able to otherwise. It can lower their barriers. And so there's been basically no research into the use of cannabis for psychedelic assisted therapy, but realize how scalable that is. You already have like 44 states or whatever that have approved it for medical recreational use. Think about the safety profile, right? It may not even have some of the key kind of side effects of MDMA that would still make sure it needs to be in a container, like elevations in your sympathetic tone, right? And heart rate and blood pressure and things like that. And mixing MDMA if you're on like SSRIs and all this other stuff. You're not doing, it's my opinion, you don't have as much of a concern of that with something like cannabis. And it's already so widely accessible and usable. And from a psychological standpoint, there are many Americans who would probably be much more open to, okay, like I'm going to do a cannabis assisted psychotherapy session than this like MDMA thing that, is ecstasy and we learned about in the past. So that's just an idea of a seed I want to throw out there as potentially the easiest and earliest psychedelic to scale for assisted therapy. It's just, there needs to be research as to how to use it. What are the right doses? Yeah. Like you mentioned, dosing is kind of wild and inter-user. So that needs to be kind of figured out. Now, to your other point, man, yeah, right. It's kind of crazy, and not just scalable throughout the US, scalable globally. It might still take a while for psilocybin or MDMA to be approved in other countries, and then insurance has to reimburse for it and all this stuff. And then you think about the supply chain of who's producing the MDMA. Well, with cannabis, it's a little more democratized. There's 1,000 different supplies you could buy from, et cetera, et cetera. So, but to your point about, for instance, the microdosing, well, I'm not an expert on this, but I've also seen in the clinical setting, they have done clinical trials on microdosing. I don't think any of them have showed that microdosing does anything beyond the placebo effect. Of the handful of microdosing studies.
A few studies. They haven't shown much difference.
Correct. And so I think that this is where it's the blending of both. It's like, how do you get as much real world as possible? And real world means people using it on their own accord in their own settings, but still having some semblance of rigor and control. And it's not uncommon that things anecdotally or observationally look great. And then you find out in a blinded head-to-head comparison against placebo, it was just the placebo effect, which is a whole different conversation entirely as to like the value of the placebo effect and should society be using it more and stuff like that, or should doctors be allowed to prescribe a placebo? You could have an entire show just on that. But going back to things like cannabis, as well as other, without actually naming names of compounds, there are other psychedelics out there that are not scheduled that could potentially represent additionally scalable therapeutics for people to use and access because they're so widely available. So that is an interesting thread as well to go down. The other thing that I like is that states are also not just decriminalizing, but legalizing things like psilocybin for medical usage. And what I think that does is it adds a nice counterbalance that if ever the FDA path became too slow, too expensive, too restrictive, only XYZ conditions are allowed, or insurance won't reimburse for it, you have states that will have legalized, say, psilocybin, or, starting with Oregon and other states will follow. And you can have therapists in that state working with this psilocybin for clients. And so it's a really good counterbalance to the kind of very rigid pharma model in cost, in time, and narrowness of who can actually have access. So I'm excited about that too. And then last thing to answer your earlier question, I think all the observational research is great. I think it provides signal that you then need to follow up and confirm with the studies. But yeah, when it comes to microdosing, I'm torn too, because I look at the handful of objective trials and I'm like, man, this doesn't really look that great. And then you look at the anecdotal data and people are really kind of raving about it. And it could be that the official trials that were done, just they were measuring the wrong parameter, right? Maybe something was funky with the inclusion exclusion criteria. There's a million reasons why, which is why I think both are relevant and both need to proceed in parallel, and they both can kind of inform one another.
Yeah, those were a lot of good points. And, to come back to what you were saying when we first started to answer this question was that MDMA assisted therapy is around the corner for FDA clearance. It's probably going to cost between $10,000 and $14,000 for one 12-week session with 3 doses of medicine and 42 hours of psychotherapy with your 2 therapists. And it has a great remission rate and a great success rate, but there's only like 700 people nationwide that know how to deliver that care. And there's 40 million people with trauma that need that care, right? So, psilocybin is 2 years away probably from FDA clearance for most likely depression. Similar time frame and probably similar expense in terms of maybe not quite the same expense, but it might be a similar expense for patients to pay for that duration of care, right? Like 12 weeks and so much psychotherapy. And even though it works, it's not the most accessible to everyone. One of the things that we see people doing, and we see, as you mentioned, decriminalization is happening, right? There are many states that have already decriminalized psilocybin mushrooms, cities that have decriminalized psilocybin mushrooms, and decriminalization is interesting because it's a double-edged sword as well, in that it certainly democratizes people's ability to be able to access medicine like psilocybin mushrooms, and in some states potentially even to grow your own. And of course that has its benefits. And it also prevents people who are incarcerated for, or will be incarcerated for, possession or in some cases selling those things, to not have such severe penalties. However, it comes with the unexpected side effect that we're now seeing years into decrim of psilocybin, which is that more people are getting psychedelic therapy from people who are not actually trained to do the work, which is something that has always been a concern to me, because a big part of my practice is helping people kind of reintegrate bad trips and helping people, reprocess traumatic experiences, including previously bad psychedelic experiences they've had. And there's not that many people who do that kind of work in my field, but it's, we see the numbers of people who are having these experiences with somebody who says, hey, I'm trained, go way up. Whereas people like me who have a license to practice medicine, I can lose my license if I'm using psilocybin in California, even though it's, it might be legal in my state or my city, it's not legal federally. So if anybody reports me to the medical board, even though I'm one of the most highly trained psychiatrists and psychotherapists that you could see in this area, I can lose my license if you're using a federal legal substance under my care. But anybody on the street can walk up to you and tell you that they're a psychedelic mushroom shaman and they have no license to use, so they're allowed to legally deliver you care, right? And so where I see the work that you're doing, tying it all together, right, with Radical coming in, is there's an opportunity for people to understand, at the very least, like, and I don't think we're there yet, but what I'm hoping is, and what I see on the horizon is, as it becomes more legal, increasingly legal, to access these kinds of psychedelic, psychoactive plants that we know less about, especially in terms of recreational use, we can start to enroll people in trials either of them using these substances recreationally, or when it becomes legal to send them to people, we can send them to people under supervised care or whatever the situation requires. But we can start to figure out why Susie took 3.5 grams of one mushroom and had the worst experience of her life, and then 3 months later took 3.5 grams of a different mushroom and had the best experience of her life, right? Because guess what? There's multiple different kinds of mushrooms, and they all have different strengths, and they all have different characteristics, just like cannabis plants. So there's still all this subtlety, I feel like, that we have to tease apart, that our traditional Western approach is just not suitable to address.
Yeah, and I think it's the way that, first off, for prescription medicine, like a psychedelic, to be the thing that invokes in fact, I don't even think the psychedelic community has fully even found consensus as to how much of this is like a neuroplasticity that's happening that then the psychotherapy is able to work upon versus needing that like mystical, ineffable experience, that spiritual experience to then kind of, wake you up to then go like process your trauma or things like that. I think the community is still split on whether you need that aspect of the journey.
You know what's funny about how it seems to split to me? All the people who are the hard scientists who don't see patients are like, it's just the neuroplasticity. It's just molecules.
Yep, makes total sense.
And then all the therapists and all the people who are actually like seeing the patients go through their transformation are like, you kidding me, guys? Like, did you see what just happened to this person? Like, there's definitely more than just molecules going on here. But it's funny that you see these, that it's true. There's still argument about that. There's still argument, and part of the why we published our gold standard paper, kind of calling for a gold standard in psychedelic medicine recently, was because we don't have any. And even to this day, there's still an argument about whether or not therapy makes psychedelic medicine experiences better. Right? Like, we know that therapy makes all mental health treatment improve outcomes, right? When you combine medicine and therapy, antidepressants and therapy, antipsychotics and therapy, methamphetamine, ADHD medicine and therapy, the outcomes are always better. Why would we think it's different for psychedelics, but we're going to argue about it anyway?
Yeah, I personally am pretty convinced that the therapeutic container that psychotherapy can offer to a psychedelic trip is very powerful. Not to say that if you were to guide your own trip and guide your own integration, great, but it's more often than not going to be better in the context of a therapist and with proper integration or proper preparation before, proper integration after as well. I'm convinced of that. But again, I think it's, speaking of these shamans, one interesting observation is like, if you look back at a lot of these indigenous societies, it was kind of just like, here, like go into the woods, drink this, and you're going to roll around for a day and, but in that sense, I think there was still integration, because you're going to go back to your tribe, you're going to go to the shaman, you're going to talk about what you said, they're going to do a ceremony around it, a ritual, and et cetera, et cetera.
There was that
exactly
the ceremony, like you were held within a communal space, right? Safe. And I think that part is sometimes missing, or often missing, in the recreational explorational approach. The indigenous ceremony stuff is fascinating, because that's like, I think in a lot of ways, it's the origins of some of the work we do in the MAP study with MDMA.
That's interesting. Well, and also if you think about the way that you might retell that story or retell the visions that you saw and what it meant, because, all the time we were just sitting around a fire, just telling stories, and you being able to recount and re-recount your spiritual vision and what it means for you and how it's coming back up in your life. That's that integration. That's psychotherapy right there in a different container from that standpoint. But you brought up a really good point, which is that people are going to have bad trips. So that's the double-edged sword. Is you want broader access, you want a counterbalance to a strict pharmaceutical approach, you want people to have self-access, you're going to inevitably lead to potentially greater bad trip. And how to help someone recover from that, that's the leading edge of this. And so it's folks like yourselves who've kind of been helping people, and thank God, folks like you, Dave, exist that can help people overcome instances like that, because I don't think there's really much official clinical guidance at all on what to do with people who've had bad trips. And I'm sure the incidences of bad trips go up when you are a novice user and you're using it without supervision. So like we saw with cannabis, you're going to have an evolution of the regulatory scheme, and it's this constant, unfortunately, trial and error that you're going to see. And even cannabis, we still don't have it right. Some states have better regulations. Some states tried something new and it was just disaster. And like, So it's going to take some evolution, but I think at its core, what I'm really excited about, there's just so many passionate people that are behind this movement. And I really do see the tremendous, tremendous potential it has for health and for just the evolution of human consciousness as well. Because again, if you're stuck in your past trauma, if you are depressed, if you're anxious, how the heck are you going to start planning to fight climate change? How the heck are you going to be thinking about your kids going to college in 15 years? You're just trying to make it through the next 7 hours. You're just trying to make it to bedtime. And so if we can help people on those areas, they will flourish in all the other domains of their life, in their community, in their personal lives, in their family lives, and investment in their own self. And that's where I get really excited. And the last thing I'll say, just because we're on the topic of all this, is I think there's also other interesting ways to induce psychedelic experiences that are currently legal as of today. Breath work and these brain entrainment, light, visual, sound thingies. And what's interesting is those in some ways could be more scalable than even cannabis or any of these others, because there's no laws prohibiting them today. And so I also look forward to a world where those modalities are increasingly used to create these altered states of consciousness that then people can find healing from trauma or can potentially address certain mental health issues.
Very well said. And I think that's a great place to end. And if I were to say, what a large point of psychedelic assisted therapy is, like, what are we doing with the psychedelic medicine, is really to help bring a person into a state of feeling calm, quiet mind, mindful, non-judgmental, maybe even some blissful love in there, right? We're trying to bring people, using the medicine, we remind people of what that state feels like so that they're calm enough and safe enough to be able to learn new things, because they're not constantly in fight or flight tunnel vision mode all the time, right? And then as soon as they get into that state where they're like, oh, wait, I can feel calm enough to learn new things. Like, I haven't felt like this in years, or decades for some people. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, this is a state, we teach them in therapy, like, this is a state you can get to on your own. The medicine is just reminding you that it's there and what it feels like. And then we teach them the practices to get there. So I think you summed it up really nicely there. Could you just leave everybody with where people can find you and learn more about Radical Sciences?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So you can always check out our website, www.radicalscience.com. And radical is spelled like particle, RADICLE. Phonetically, it sounds radical because that's what we're here to do. We're here to make some waves. But that spelling of radical means the root of the plant. And we're here to get to the root of truth. We're here to, get grounded in science. And if you're interested, you can volunteer to be in our studies. And if you want to get in touch, you can also find me. All of my social media handles are at Dr. Jeff Chen, at Dr. Jeff Chen across Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. So if you want to shoot me a DM and chat about anything. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for having me, Dave.
Thanks so much for joining me, Jeff. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to The Psychedelic Report. Visit us at thepsychedelicreport.com. This show is recorded weekly on Clubhouse with a live audience. The Psychedelic Report was brought to you by Apollo Neuroscience and produced by Future Medicine Media. While I am a doctor, I'm not your doctor. So please don't take anything you hear on the Psychedelic Report as personal medical advice, because we don't know you. If you have questions about anything you hear on this show, please consult with your doctor.